I'm Jacob with Alberta 3D. This is the Anycubic Vyper I bought, and this is a 500% Benchy that I printed with it. And I'm going to tell you guys all about my experience with the Vyper. Welcome back to my basement. I wanted to show you guys this giant Benchy. The main reason I printed this is I wanted to print something bigger than I ever had on my new printer because it is bigger than my other printers. But when I went to print this big Benchy, it wouldn't actually fit at 500%. It ended up being like 480%. So I wanted to go to a round number so that I could measure it later and see how it matched up for calibration and actually use it as a Benchy. But what I had to do that was I had to tell Cura that this printer was a little bit bigger. So when they, Anycubic settings that they give you to set it up, they tell you to tell it the bed size is 245 by 245. But actually, if you measure it, it's 245 by almost 270. And so what I did to print this was I told it was 245 by 265. It wouldn't slice, but it wasn't actually off the edge. So I ended up printing it, telling it it was 255 by 265. And having done a little test print before, I printed a 245 square on it. Realized it prints right to the edge, no problem. So I told it was 255 by 265. Put it not quite in a 45, but a little bit the long way, and it would slice without a skirt. And yeah, it actually printed okay, but this was mostly the default profile because I wanted to have it done in a day so that I could start printing some Starship parts. So I had a timeline I wanted to get it done in, and I thought, you know what, if it doesn't look great, at least I'll have this giant Benchy, even if it doesn't look great. So let's examine the Benchy here. So there is some little, well, it's hard to see probably on there, but there's some little dots across here, which some might think is because it's printing too fast for the board, but that only happens on 8-bit machines, and this is a 32-bit machine. So what I think is actually happening here is it was over extruding, because I didn't check my E-steps before. Again, it was because I wanted to hurry up and print stuff. And also, it was printing too fast and over extruding, and so I think that's how these layer lines happen. I wasn't there to watch it happen. I saw it mostly up before the first time it had a crash or whatever. But yeah, so these steps here you see was only on the y-axis, nothing on the x for some reason, but I think it was because it was a travel move and it had over extruded, and I noticed when it was printing down lower, it was printing the infill too heavily and some of the spots were sticking up. So I think at some point the nozzle must have crashed into the infill and caused that little shift. Because other than that, it was fine. And I don't think it's a limitation of the distance that it could travel, because there's not a consistent stop point.
Slight correction, it's actually because the roller was crashing into the end stop.
When that happens, the belt jumps one tooth. So it keeps printing good, but slightly over. That it couldn't print beyond. So I think it was just because it was over extruding, crashed in the infill a couple times. But the rest of it, pretty decent for a giant Benchy. And you can see the infill through it, but that's because it's only 2 layers. Again, press for time. So if you want a good Benchy, don't print a fast Benchy. But if you want it done in a day, I'm impressed by the Anycubic Vyper. So this printed in a day. It was, I think, 23 hours, if I remember right. It was much better than I expected it to look, and faster. So, that said, the Vyper has been really good, but the profile they include with it, I think, is a little bit too fast. Because it does not do a really high quality print at its own settings. So, I printed a Benchy. First thing I printed was the owl that they included. Now, if you get one of these, they'll probably have changed it by the time you get one, but for some reason, They didn't put the OWL on the parent directory on the SD card, and you can't print from a folder on the SD card. It has to be in the parent directory. So all I had to do on my computer was copy that file over to the main part of the SD card, and then I was able to print it from there. And it printed pretty good, but again, same little blips and blobs that this had. But much smaller because, of course, finer layer height, and this is their own G code, so the speed settings aren't just the same as their slicer profile. It's not bad. It's actually really good. So for straight out of the box, very little setup. Just did an auto level, installed like 6 bolts. It's really easy to set up and start printing. And pretty decent off the bat. But then I printed the Benchy with their slicer profile, and it actually looked pretty poor. So this is way worse than the OWL. And again, I think it's down to the over extrusion. So after that one, I did a bunch of calibrating, calibrated these steps, calibrated the dimensions, and did another print. This is at a 0.12 layer height. And the only problem I had, I think mostly due to my inexperience with a volcano hot end, was stringing. So there is some stringing, and as a result, there's a bit of these little build-up in between on the windows. But other than that, turned out pretty good. And this was slower than their settings. Not by a lot, because they have it set at 80. I went down to about 60. Outer walls, I think I had them at 40. So still pretty quick, much quicker than my other 2 printers can do. And it turned out decent. Since then, I have done a lot more tuning and practicing with the slicer profile to get some much better prints out of it. Before I did even more tuning, I printed this all-in-one printer test. I actually sliced it even smaller than the micro test. So it's my tiny, tiny test. But it tests the bridging, it tests the stringing, it tests the overhang angles, and it did all those things quite good, pretty accurate, and still relatively quick compared to my other machines. Now that's down to having a volcano hot end, and it also has dual fans. The cooling fans, it has one on each side. So it's not just a duct that wraps around, it's actually 2 separate fans, so it cools much better, one on either side of the print head. It doesn't blow as hard as, say, my other printers, which have a single 50 by 15 blower fan. It has the more typical style, like 40 by 10 flatter, thinner blower fans. So it's not quite as strong as some of the add-on ones, but I really want to leave this one stock and not modify it, because my goal here is to find a printer that I can just leave completely stock, and if down the road I need more printers, I can just have another one exactly the same and not have to spend a lot of time modifying it to get it to do what I want. So for that, this is excellent, because it does print really fast. One of my favorite features is the spring steel plate. Before this, I've never had the spring steel plate. I've only had glass. Well, I had one that was just a rough texture, but I put a piece of glass on top almost immediately because it was not flat. Oh, speaking of spring steel plate, the print just came loose as we were talking. That is unfortunate. So, simple enough. I can stop it. Wow, I'm shocked. I've printed this exact same print a few times, but adjusted my Z offset to have a little less squish, and maybe that's my problem. Oh, also I printed this a little bit colder, so I guess I need to increase the temperature on the first few layers probably to help that. Fascinating. So that's not a fault of the Anycubic Vyper. That's my fault. Settings and Z offset. Yeah, so now it's much quieter. Now it's not running. But you can still hear the fans. Majority of the fan noise on this one seems to actually come from the power supply and possibly electronics fan as well for the main board. The hot end fans are not as loud as you'd think, so it is actually pretty decent. They've done a better job than some of the other ones. They don't have those really loud fans. You can talk over it and be around it while it's printing. It has silent stepper drivers, but I've noticed on the faster moves, particularly on the Y where it needs a little more torque, it actually makes a bit of noise. You can hear it. So it's not completely silent, but if you do print slowly, it is. So let's talk about some of the features on the Vyper. It has automatic leveling, which is unique to the other printers in that it does not have any adjustment at all on the bottom. You cannot turn any wheels to adjust the build plate at all. It's completely automatic. It has two different switches on the side. They're actually photoelectric sensors. So it's a very precise mark on each side because it has dual lead screws. So it can set the gantry dead level, so it's not twisted one way or the other. And after it's done that, it will do a test where the nozzle touches various places on the build plate, and it can compensate for slight warp in the build plate. So it does that once it's all heated up. It's very easy. You just hit prepare, hit leveling, auto leveling, simple. I'm not going to do it now because it takes a little while. It doesn't take that long, but it's not fast, because I know some people have seen the Prusas. They go boop, 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 almost in real time. This one is deep, 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 deep. But it does the job. It works well. Now, there is one exception on that. I wanted to talk about some of the issues I had with this printer. I only had two real problems. One was this plastic cover. The first time I tightened the bolt for the Y-axis, it actually popped open. The plastic snapped down. I think it's because the screw is actually pressing down on the plastic, but I didn't want to take it all apart without having the replacement parts. So I sent a picture, I submitted it to Anycubic. I just sent an email to them following their instructions on their warranty card. Very simple. Next day they got back to me, understood what I was talking about, mentioned my picture and said, yes, that's what's happened, this is broken. They said, we'll send you a new one, just have to fill out this form. It was actually really simple. So, no arguments. They didn't ask me a bunch of different questions. They didn't ask me to send them a ton of information. They just needed me to fill out the form, which of course included my name, address, and serial number of the machine. And yeah, simply by having that picture, simple enough. So I have not received the replacement parts yet. Apparently they're on order. But just when I was about to fill out that form, I wanted to try the other side of the plate. So this spring steel plate has PEI coating on it. That's that gold color. And if you flip it over, it still has the coating. Now, they don't specifically say you can use this side. I know other machines, other manufacturers that make these sheets, you can use the smooth side. I did attempt to use it, but the first time I attempted to use it, I knew that I needed to do another auto level. And when I went to do it, it actually had the nozzle press into the bed really hard, make a beep, and then go back to home. And it just sat here saying auto leveling. So it didn't actually auto level, and it had an issue with the leveling. So again, I emailed them and said auto leveling's not working, described it to them, said that it pressed down into the bed and then just went back to home. The person replied to me the next day. Obviously there's a time difference, so when I'm emailing them, it's not their business day. So by the time their next business day, they had emailed me back, and same thing, very straightforward. They said, yes, your strain gauge has failed. We will send you a new one. And they sent me a link to the video on how to replace it. It's actually very simple to replace. It's just in the hot end here. So basically, it's what holds the nozzle. So at the heat break inside there, I don't have one to show you, but the heat break that's in there is actually mounted to a little bit of a bracket. I think it's metal, or it's some other alloy that's mounted to that will bend. So that piece of metal will bend, and in bending, it creates a tiny bit of current that a sensor can pick up, and it knows when it's bending. So as it comes over and touches the build plate, it starts to bend a tiny bit when the nozzle touches, and that's how it knows where the bed is. And it just does that all around. Apparently it's the same setup as a Creality CR6, but I've never had experience with that machine. So that's what it does. I think it's 16 points. I don't know. Several points on here it tests. It's very good. Seems to work. But yeah, mine failed. Fortunately, even though that has failed, and it did that push into the bed and return to home thing, the bed seems fine. Doesn't seem to be warped. I checked that it hadn't bent the bed by doing that. Seems okay. And it's still printing. So I have had no issues with the printing. Prints just fine. The only thing is I have to, of course, set the Z offset myself, but it's the same as before. So it seems to have remembered the first time I had it do its auto level. It's kept that. So even though the strain gauge failed, it still prints, and I can still print okay. I just can't change, move the sheet around or something like that. So by flipping the sheet, I'm potentially changing exactly how flat it is. So when I did try to print, it didn't stick properly. It actually came loose, and I could tell by where it was printing there was a bit of a high spot. And I know that the auto leveling would compensate for that. So it still prints, it works. Oh yeah, so the lead screws on this actually have a anti-backlash nut. So there's a spring holding the two, basically it has two nuts that are held by a spring so that there's no play in the nut. Because usually when you put a nut on a lead screw or a bolt, there's a little bit of wiggle, it's never perfectly tight. So what they've done is they have two that are held apart by a spring, and that actually keeps them tight. So that can make for very even layer lines. I don't really know for sure. This owl is really good, hardly shows any layer lines at all. And I believe that's a result of having those anti-backlash lead screws and also dual lead screws, so that it's very even all the way up and you don't have any wiggle at all in the lead screws. On a machine with only one lead screw, what will happen is there's a bit of flex in the side to side, so the gantry can actually be moving up and down on the one side separately from the other. So as it's pushed up and down, this might not quite go up and down with it. So that's what the advantage of having two lead screws is. It always is even both sides, and that gives you even better layer lines. Actually, my Benchy turned out really well as well. There's almost no layer lines here. So the backlash seems, the anti-backlash and the dual lead screws seem to be working well. I need to print some large cylinder to see how clean it really is. So on the Anycubic Vyper, they have a filament runout sensor, which will stop the print, actually pause the head and move it out of the way from the print, so that you can change the filament out and resume printing without any issues. So you won't have a blob or a mark where you change filament, because you can fully unload it and reload it by being able to pull out the filament and put in a new one. It's a very nice feature, because then you can actually finish off your roll. And it also has this special extruder. It's the same as they have on the Mega Zero, which is the other one I have, which was their very bare bones budget printer. It doesn't even have a heated bed or nothing. It has been impeccably reliable. This extruder has lasted that whole time, better than the VoxLab Aquila I have, and it's dual gear, and you can print flexible with it. I've actually printed on my other machine. I printed TPE, which is even floppier than TPU. It's basically like loading a wet noodle into your printer. It's shocking that it prints at all. So this will print that. It has that dual drive extruder, very tight fitting in there, so it can't bunch up inside. On a standard Ender 3 or something like that, you cannot print flexibles, but on this, you can. So in my opinion, Anycubic Vyper is a good printer. Be great for somebody who's starting out for the first time, and good for someone who's experienced, because they already have added all the features you would normally want to add to your printer. It has the dual cooling fans, it has the magnetic build plate, which is a total game changer because it makes it so easy to change out your prints, and with the auto leveling, makes it real easy to learn how to print and to get consistent, successful prints. So I hope my video showed you guys somewhat my opinion on the Vyper and also on their customer service. So hopefully you guys can get your own printers and print bigger and faster every day.